All right, I hope everybody's having a great day. This particular talk is going to be on the adrenal gland and the pineal gland. So the adrenal glands are paired, pyramid-shaped organs that sit just above the kidneys. Actually, they sit on top of the kidneys. They're structurally and functionally two different glands. The outer portion is called the adrenal cortex. It's 3 layers of glandular tissue that synthesizes and secretes several different hormones, and that's kind of important. It's glandular tissue. And then the adrenal medulla is nervous tissue that is part of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex is this area is going to produce over 24 different hormones, collectively called corticosteroids. Steroid hormones are not stored in cells, and their rate of release actually depends on the rate of synthesis. There's 3 different layers of cortical cells that produce different corticosteroids. The outer layer is known as the zona glomerulosa, and it's going to produce mineralocorticoids. The middle layer is the zona fasciculata, and this is going to produce glucocorticoids. And then there's the zona reticularis, and this is going to produce gonatocorticoids. And then we see each of the layers: glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. So we start off by talking about the mineralocorticoids. These are going to regulate electrolyte concentrations primarily of sodium and potassium in the extracellular fluid. ECF means extracellular fluid. And if you kind of think back to AMP1, hopefully you can remember some of the important things that sodium and potassium do, but if you don't, it's listed right here. So the importance of sodium is that it affects extracellular fluid volume, blood pressure, and then levels of other ions like potassium, hydrogen, bicarbonate, chloride. And the importance of potassium is that it sets resting membrane potential of cells. And then aldosterone is the most potent mineralocorticoid, and what it does is it stimulates sodium reabsorption by the kidneys, which is going to cause an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. And it's also going to stimulate the elimination of potassium by the kidneys. The effects of aldosterone are short-lived. We're actually going to spend several slides talking about aldosterone, but the effects are short-lived. It stimulates the synthesis and activation of sodium-potassium ATPase transport pumps, and this pump just exchanges sodium for potassium. And then there are factors that regulate aldosterone secretion. The first 3 are going to increase aldosterone secretion, and the last one's going to inhibit aldosterone secretion. And so we have the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, plasma concentration of potassium, ACTH, and atrial natriuretic peptide. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism is one we spend a little bit more time talking about when we get to the urinary system, but here we will talk about it as well. So if in the body, first of all, there are special cells in the kidneys, and if those special cells, if there is a decrease in blood pressure, it's going to stimulate those special cells in the kidney to release something called renin into the blood. Renin is going to cleave off part of plasma protein angiotensinogen, which is going to trigger an enzyme cascade, which is going to result in conversion to angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 is a potent stimulator of aldosterone release. Plasma concentrations of potassium will directly influence, what I should say is an increase in plasma concentrations of potassium will directly influence the zona glomerulosa to release aldosterone. So an increase will stimulate aldosterone release, but low levels of potassium will actually inhibit it. And then ACTH can cause small increases of aldosterone during periods of increased stress. And then finally, we talk about atrial natriuretic peptide. And this one is going to block aldosterone secretion. And this is secreted by the heart, which makes sense. It's called atrial, right? It's secreted by the heart in response to high blood pressure. And remember, aldosterone is going to cause an increase in blood pressure. So if you already have high blood pressure, you don't want it to get any higher. So what it's going to do is it's going to block renin, so it can't do that other mechanism we talked about on the last slide, and aldosterone secretion to decrease blood pressure. Excuse me. And this is what each of these are showing. So we have the first one is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. That decrease in blood volume is going to trigger the secretion of renin, which is going to cause that enzyme cascade, which is going to produce angiotensin 2, which is going to cause the secretion or the release of aldosterone. Also, an increase in potassium in the blood causes those cells in the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. ACTH, which is released in response to stress, can also cause an increase in aldosterone release. And then we have this last one, atrial natriuretic peptide. I'm trying to get my cursor back, and it's not. There we go. This is going to inhibit the secretion of aldosterone. Then we have glucocorticoids. These are going to influence metabolism of most cells and help us resist stressors. They keep blood glucose levels relatively constant. They maintain blood pressure by increasing the action of vasoconstrictors. And then when we start talking about glucocorticoid hormones, the one that we really talk about is cortisol, because that's the only one that's found in significant amounts in humans. But there's also cortisone and corticosterone. But we're only going to talk about cortisol. Okay, so we're going to talk about the regulation of secretion of cortisol, and it is released in response to ACTH. And ACTH is released in response to corticotropin-releasing hormone. And corticotropin-releasing hormone is released in response to low cortisol levels. So hopefully you're kind of seeing the pattern here. Low cortisol levels causes corticotropin-releasing hormone to be released, which is then going to cause ACTH to be released, which is then going to cause cortisol to be released. Now, once cortisol is released, an increase in cortisol levels will actually inhibit ACTH and corticotropin-releasing hormone by negative feedback, or through negative feedback, however you want to say that. Cortisol secretion cycles are governed by patterns of eating and activity. Acute stress, such as infection, physical or emotional trauma, can interrupt cortisol rhythm. And then we have another override mechanism with this particular hormone, and that's the central nervous system can override cortisol inhibition of ACTH and corticotropin-releasing hormone, leading to more cortisol secretion. So what does cortisol do? It causes an increase in blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. Its prime metabolic effect is something called gluconeogenesis. In this, gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose from fats and proteins. And what it does is encourages cells to use fatty acids for fuel so that the brain gets to get the good stuff, the glucose. Other functions are, another function is to enhance vasoconstriction. It can cause a rise in blood pressure quickly to help distribute nutrients to cells. Excessive levels of glucocorticoids do a number of things. They depress cartilage and bone formation, inhibit inflammation by decreasing release of inflammatory chemicals, depress the immune system, and disrupt normal cardiovascular, neuro, and GI functions. Glucocorticoid drugs can control symptoms of many inflammatory diseases such as arthritis and allergies, but it can also cause a number of undesirable effects. And then finally, we talk about the gonatocorticoids. These are weak androgens, and an androgen is a male sex hormone. And these weak androgens are converted to testosterone in tissues, some to estrogens. And we have a couple of examples down here, including DHEA. Here are the examples, including the DHEA. And it may contribute to the onset of puberty and appearance of secondary sex characteristics, sex drive in women, and it's a source of estrogens in postmenopausal women. And then finally, we have the adrenal medulla. And the medullary chromaffin cells synthesize catecholamines, epinephrine 80%, norepinephrine 20%. The effect of catecholamines are vasoconstriction, increased heart rate, increased blood glucose levels, and then blood is diverted to brain, heart, and skeletal muscles. Both epinephrine and norepinephrine have about the same effects, but epinephrine is more of a stimulator of metabolic activities, such as 1. Bronchodilation and blood flow to skeletal muscles and heart. And then I should have said 1 and then 2. So 1, bronchodilation, and 2, blood flow to skeletal muscles and heart. And then we have norepinephrine. This has more of an influence on peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure. And responses to stressors are brief, unlike adrenal cortical hormones. And this is just showing the stress. So we have somebody running from a fire. So we have action potentials from the hypothalamus are sent down to activate the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system sends a signal. The catecholamines are released into the blood. And then we have cardiovascular effects, which would be like to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, bronchial dilate, to help oxygenate the blood. We have some metabolic effects. Let's see. To increase blood glucose, which is just going to give us more glucose available. Increased metabolic rate. And then I left this in here as well, and you can go over that one. This one is going over the effects of like long-term stress. So this is a table, and this is just going over various hormones, various adrenal gland hormones. And what they do, if it's something that's listed that we talked about or that I just talked about, then you need to know it. But if it's additional, you do not need to know it. So, for example, this last column here, effects of hyper and hyposecretion, that will not be on the test, but it may be a group wiki or it may be a bonus question. Then we have the pineal gland. This is a small gland hanging from the roof of the third ventricle. Pinealocytes secrete melatonin derived from serotonin. Melatonin may affect a number of things. The one that you probably know is the circadian rhythms, day and night cycles, but it also affects the timing of sexual maturation and puberty, physiological processes that show rhythmic variations like body temperature, sleep, appetite, and then the production of antioxidant and detoxification molecules in cells. And the pineal gland is up here. Where's my cursor? It's up here in the brain. And the adrenal glands are again here and here. These are your questions. That is all I have for you for this topic.